Good afternoon. I'm Jen King. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley at the School of Information. And I spend most of my time worrying about consumer privacy. I actually look at it from a human-computer interaction perspective. So I spend a lot of time doing user experience research as well as surveys and other types of things where I try to get into the meat of how people think about privacy, particularly online. And I've spent the last year or two doing research on mobile phones. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the insights I have from smartphone research. And some of my background also has been in video surveillance, so which I think has been kind of an interesting piece of the puzzle for today's conversation.
I'm Jules Polonsky. I'm the executive director of an industry-supported think tank called the Future of Privacy Forum. We're based in DC. Half of my board are the chief privacy officers, or the folks primarily focused on privacy at 70 or 80 companies, from the Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, Facebooks of the world, to retail location companies, to some big brands, to retailers. People who work at the intersection of consumer, tech, and data. The places where there's value to businesses, value to consumers, but where there's clearly a clash when new technologies are being used in new ways. The other half of my board, and this is, I think, a little bit unique, are privacy academics, privacy advocates, and even some privacy regulators. So I'm forced to sit in the middle and come up with compromise solutions that address the concerns of certainly the regulators and the policymakers, but at the end of the day, we're industry supported, and our goal is to help support responsible companies and responsible people at companies that are trying to come up with the right way to do it. I was the chief privacy officer at AOL. I was the chief privacy officer at DoubleClick. I was the consumer affairs commissioner for the city of New York, a state legislator, a Hill staffer, a lawyer, and I'm about 85 years old, as you can see.
Okay, so you were a lawyer?
I am a lawyer.
You are a lawyer? Are you still active?
Here and there, here and there.
Okay, all right. I'm a former lawyer, that's why I ask. Okay, so Jules, why don't you tell us, this was going to be Laura's job, but she's not here, so why don't you tell us the state of the law as you understand it in relation to all this indoor stuff that we've been talking about. And you've been here all day, so give us the sort of synopsis.
Yeah, well, in DC, we really see the effect of the government shutdown. It takes me, 15 minutes less to get to work in the morning, and I figure here maybe you all don't feel it. So Laura not showing up is because the government is shut. So you at least sort of feel that firsthand. So I have both good news and bad news, I think, for lots of you, and clearly there are a lot of people sensitive to data issues, and we talked about it earlier in the day. But let me go through perhaps the landscape just to sort of help set the stage. So is Congress going to step in and legislate and restrict the use of location? I guess when the government is shut down and you see that we can't do a budget and we can't increase the debt limit, and we might, clearly Congress is not going to do anything at all in any way, shape, or form on just about anything in the very near future. And even before this shutdown, I think there were 18 bills that had passed, most of them things that had to be extended. So there's not a huge amount of real direct legislative threat. Now, that doesn't mean that members of the House or Senate are not going to try to cause pain by sending letters, holding press conferences, focusing a media attention and a spotlight on the areas that they're most concerned about. The two senators who've been most interested are not actually on the two committees that have the most relevant jurisdiction. Senator Schumer and Senator Franken have both made location privacy, retail analytics, an issue. They've written to companies, they've held press conferences. They're on the Judiciary Committee, which does have privacy jurisdiction when it comes to things like stalking, when it comes to criminal penalties and what the FBI does. Although you do hear some advocates being very critical and talking about, tracking as stalking or stealing data or the like, I think most reasonable folks know that this goes through the consumer protection side of the Senate, where Senator Rockefeller, the chair of Senate Energy and Commerce, holds sway. Now, he really does care about privacy. His focus has been do not track. And if the World Wide Web Consortium, the folks that are working on setting up a standard or trying to get consensus around do not track, fail at doing so, he's going to do his best to push through do not track legislation. Now, does that mean do not track my Mac? Well, right now he's thinking, cookies and online. But once there's a vehicle, that goes somewhere because there's an impetus behind it, well, then maybe Senator Franken, who has this location bill, says, could you add mine in here too, please? And you actually have things happening. So likely not a serious legislative threat, but certainly a shine the light and senators keeping pressure. You folks in California, for those of you who are local, are the legislative threat. California has become the national privacy legislator. There have been 3 bills passed, and again, these are California laws, but for most folks, you can't exclude California, customers. Maybe when it comes to location, you can, but for certainly most tech companies, what is the law in California de facto ends up being, what their practice is year-round. So who knows what California does? And you've been passing these bills overwhelmingly, despite lobbying from a lot of local tech companies who might be affected. You've passed a do not track bill, unanimously in both houses, and so there's certainly a state threat should somehow one of the state legislators say, location, let me get that on the ballot. So what about the FTC? Because the FTC is the enforcement entity. Laura, who was going to be here, hopefully would have told us what the FTC thinks. So we've spent a lot of time talking to the FTC to understand what they think and what they'd like to see. And we've, together with a number of companies in the room here, put together a code of conduct that we've run by the commission, and we've said, look, what do you think about this? Are we saying this right? Here's how we're talking about de-identification. Here's how we're talking about a central opt-out that everybody can use so a consumer doesn't have to walk through a store and walk through a mall or walk through the street and go to 20 places if this is something they don't want to participate in. How can we make people feel, leave aside the nuances of privacy, that we're not going to do bad things with this data? What can we say we won't do? Can we say, look, this is not going to be used for, insurance decisions. This is not going to be used for, credit decisions. Can we take off the table the things that consumers or that policymakers, think when they imagine what could go wrong? And so we've put a whole bunch of those things in the code. Now we're working through how you might do some sort of in-store notice or some just-in-time notice. And that's challenging, right? Lots of retailers, putting up a sign is clearly something they want to think about. There are lots of people who want them to put up lots of signs, and there are lots of folks in the store who have ideas, around signage. And it's not clear that consumers see signage, right? They walk in, there's a lot of things going on, there's a lot of, senses. And so what we've done is we've partnered with a consumer expert, a design expert, and we've said, how could you, if you wanted to, in a friendly and engaging way, but a candid way that lets them know what's going on, talk to users about this? And let's recognize that for retailers, this isn't the only thing they're doing, right? It may not just be location analytics. They are probably looking at other in-store technologies. And so, who wants a whole list of signs? Now we're doing this, now we're doing this. How do you perhaps take this in a holistic way? And I'll kind of start to close with this. Taking it in a holistic way, frankly, is I think what we need to do to avoid the problems of the web. Look what's happening on the web. And again, there's good news and bad news. The good news is lots of people have built out successful businesses doing ad targeting, doing tracking, building ad exchanges and data exchanges, and it's kind of worked. But it took 10 years to kind of put together a good self-regulatory mechanism by labeling ads and giving better opt-outs. And by the time we did it, we kind of made enemies of the platforms and of the consumers. So we have Mozilla getting ready to block third-party cookies, right? We have the mobile ecosystem looking very different. Apple already pulling back, MAC address because of concerns about how apps were perhaps passing it on. We've created, I think, because we were a bit too slow and because the brands didn't get into it. The third parties, the ad networks all solved the privacy problem in the background by coming up with rules, but the brands didn't lean into it. And so we have this adversarial situation where certainly companies are succeeding, but we're losing the war, and folks are starting to think about digital fingerprinting, ways that they can, avoid the browser controls. And the browsers are talking about how they're going to defeat digital fingerprinting. I don't know that that's a good future, right, for those of us who want to see people giving us more data to get a good experience, to make money, to please them, by selling them things. And so
Jules, let me stop you. Okay, it's a lot of good information, but let me go to Jen. We'll come back to you in a second.
Back to my ice cream.
What's that?
I'll go back to my ice cream.
Go back to your ice cream. So you've done a ton of consumer research around privacy, and I presented a few modest data slides this morning that showed consumers wanted control, but they would trade location information for a benefit. What has your research revealed about consumer attitudes toward privacy? What sort of statements can you make to this audience about the general consumer sensibility around privacy, especially with mobile?
Well, there's definitely a spectrum, so it's not kind of an either or. So you're always going to have 15, 20% of customers who don't care. They'll give you anything, they don't have any suspicion, they just don't care. And then on the other side, you'll have another 20% who are extreme in their privacy views, and then you'll have a big group in the middle. So we know there's a spectrum, and that holds across a lot of different privacy surveys that have been done. In terms of mobile and location, so I have done some qualitative research on phones, and I always have to have my prop here to hold up. And one of the things I found, I'll just give you a couple highlights. I mean, people love their phones. They absolutely love them. You probably all also love your phones. I mean, part of that is that they are extremely useful. And I think that's something to really keep in mind in terms of, as you think ahead to the type of products that you might be offering, the real concrete value proposition there. And some of the things that people really love about their phones is they're essentially Swiss Army knives, and the fact that they can go out there and solve real life problems with them. And location is certainly a part of that. And when I did my interviews with iPhone and Android users, location came up again and again as one of basically the killer apps of the phone, from the point of view of people using the location services to get what they need. And I think another piece that is important to the picture is that people also don't have a lot of awareness of how apps work. That might be changing over time as apps have gotten more and more out there and people are kind of understanding how apps function. But when I did my work, there's a lot of misunderstandings about what's really going on. And people actually don't really differentiate between apps and browsers, or they didn't at the time I did my work. So there's a lot of confusion. People don't really understand who's tracking and where stuff is coming from. It's a very cloudy understanding of how these phones operate. And what that feeds into is people tend to have a lot of trust in some of the guardians on their phones. So if you're an iPhone user, people really trusted the iPhone store. Sorry, the name just left me.
App Store.
App Store, yes. People really had a lot of trust in that Apple was looking out for them and kind of vetting apps. Android users, not so much, but again, there was this sense that if they were getting apps from marketplaces, then clearly they had adhered to some kind of standard, which if you've done any work on Android, that's actually not true. Apple, somewhat. Apple does review apps to some degree. But what this all feeds into is a sense that people tend to present choices about consumers as if they're clearly understanding that they're making this privacy trade-off. And what I found is that's not really the case. In fact, they're often making these decisions either kind of like holding their nose and just hoping that they're doing the right thing, or that they have this belief that there are actually laws and privacy policies and things out there that are actually protecting them, when in fact that is often not the case. That's certainly true with privacy policies. If anybody here has ever had the pleasure of writing one, you know that it doesn't actually mean that you're protecting anyone's privacy. It's just disclosing the practices that you're engaging in, and that could be selling off as much data as you want. You just have to disclose that you're doing it. I think the last piece of the puzzle here, too, is that when I asked people about information sharing, they really didn't have a problem sharing information with first parties. So if I am using the LinkedIn app, and LinkedIn wants information from me, people generally had a trusting relationship with the apps they chose, again, kind of based on all that background infrastructure that's holding them, they think, accountable. And trusting that the relationship they have with these first parties is something that is going to be honored, I guess, that they're not going to be taken advantage of. But when you get into third-party data gathering, when I did the work with my group, they universally hated it, quite frankly. People were really nervous and they often felt taken advantage of when you talk about third-party data gathering. So I think that is a really important insight for this room, that you need to be very cautious about the value proposition you're offering, because people often feel like they are being taken advantage of when data is being gathered about them without their knowledge.
So let's focus on I'm sorry, Jules, that I had to cut you off earlier. Let's focus on two questions. I mean, I wish we had an hour for this conversation. One question is, how do the people that are doing the back office stuff, the retail analytics, that doesn't really have a corresponding consumer side, they're just gathering information on consumer movements, how do those folks handle the privacy question? That's one question. And the other is, what's the best practice that you can currently recommend for the consumer-facing people in terms of what needs to be disclosed to them and what sort of consent, opt-in or opt-out, that they need to deliver? Now, why don't we each of you take one of those?
Take the second one.
Okay, jump in.
Sure. So I would argue that when you have a first-party relationship with a customer, you need to think about the value proposition you're offering. And right now, I think there's a lot of information asymmetry here. And I think that's part of what feeds into a lot of the battles around things like do not track, and at least on the web. The fact that companies, these nameless companies, seemingly know a lot about you, and as a consumer, they're kind of faceless and abstract. Moving into the physical space, I think the relationship changes slightly. It becomes flesh and blood, and I think that's why we've seen some of the negative reactions that we have in the press around indoor tracking, because suddenly it's no longer abstract. When it's on the web, I think people often can't put a face to it because it's a completely abstract process. But suddenly, if I know somebody is using a video camera to follow me around, it changes the dimension. So in terms of a best practice, I'm always in favor of opt-in rather than opt-out. I know that can cause a lot of grief among designers, but that certainly would be one of my recommendations. And did I touch on everything you were? Can you?
That's fine. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's go to Jules. You can comment on either side, the consumer side or the back office.
Well, I think the challenge is that they have to fit together. We're never going to manage to convince consumers that they should love data exchanges, that they should love marketing, but yet they do respond to marketing and they do have experiences that they see as positive. But we're never going to get them to, in theory, say, great, sell my data, I understand that it supports a more competitive ecosystem and that I'll get more relevant, right? Except when they end up having a relationship that appears to be serving them, so we have to link that first and third party. Now, there are things those third parties can do, right? You can provide transparency so that the accusations of, here's how this data is being used against me, right? When you think about the negatives that get thrown at the third-party data use, they're very often, here are the things that are going to happen that are bad, right? So you won't get a job, or you'll get discriminated, or you'll get things intruding upon you. And so by taking off the table the things that are not done, we're going to market. The worst thing we're going to do is try to give you something relevant, and we won't do this sort of price discrimination, or we won't do these sorts of things. Maybe we provide some transparency that's actually useful. I like to talk about featureizing data, providing it not so I can go there and look it up and see my profile, because do I really care? But can I do something with it? Can I download it? Can I make it inform some other app? Can I make it usable to me in some way? And so my argument to the the folks who are competing with Amazon is, be Amazon and don't think about it as privacy, right? Amazon doesn't have to make a privacy disclosure on its homepage. It says, we think you like this because other people like this, and you kind of get from that communication, well, they're tracking you, they're tracking everybody, and and data is being used. So, you know what we need to do? I rented a car the other day in a strange city, and I didn't read the manual. I got in, I drove it, and it's dangerous. I could kill somebody with it, but yet I did it without any guidance. We need to figure out how to make the UIs for me navigating this world of data and of location easy enough that it feels like a consumer feature. Otherwise, I think we're going to have policymaker stress, media stress, but I think worse, we're going to have the platforms who have to be motivated to support what we're doing. And if they see this as adversarial to consumers, right? We talked about Apple not, really being as big in the data game. If for some reason there's some stress to users because the device, doesn't feel as trustworthy, they pull it, right? When they told users that the ecosystem that they were going to pull device IDs, everybody was like, oh my God, is my business going to go away? And okay, they ended up providing the IDFA. If we're going to be dependent on someone else's infrastructure, we have to make sure that we're perceived as delightful and magical, and we've got to figure out how we tie to the value equation. We need to be talking more about reducing times online. We need to talk about how this does support customization of offers, and we've got to take off the table all of the spooky things that the critics might accuse us of doing.
So Jules, real quickly on the Nordstrom example. So we have Will in here saying their disclosures were maybe not as artful as they should have been. What's an example? Revisit that situation very succinctly. What's the best practice in that situation? So a store wants to track movements. It doesn't have a consumer app. What's the disclosure? What needs to be said?
So I don't think that the reaction, in Nordstrom or Euclid was due to the signage, right? This is a new technology that the media really find interesting now because it's new and it's got this, here's how I can describe it in a way that's creepy. Given that Nordstrom had a sign, there was a nice venue to say, hey, look, consumer, look at that. What do you think? Aren't you scared? And so forth. I followed most of the stories, and if you follow them and they actually ask consumers, well, what would you want? How should it work? They end up, saying somewhat surprisingly reasonable things. Well, I want to know if it's happening. I want to be able to turn it off. I want to know that no one's doing anything, harmful or bad with it. So we've asked a top designer to design for us something that maybe is akin to a symbol or some language, something that is intended to speak to a consumer. So I think a privacy notice, is the Band-Aid, is you have something to worry about and we're doing a disclosure here, so, you're on notice. I don't want to be on notice. I want to be served. So Disney's rolling out its magic bands and people are going to pay for them. We need to, tie this to the extent we can to that value experience, to that premium experience. We want to know when our best customers are in the store because here's what we do. We bring them to the front of the line. We, whatever it is. I've traded all my privacy to cut the line, at airports with TSA and Clear and, whatever I can pay for. So this was mostly a media issue, and let's talk about it because it's not a media issue when we're talking about it. It's a media issue when the press are discovering and exposing things that are going on. So the more we shout it from the rooftops, here's what our smart store does to serve customers well, there's no story anymore. It's part of our consumer value proposition, but we've got to talk about it like that.
Just to add to that for a second, I think of it maybe as pulling your punches in the sense that you may have the capability to do an extreme form of micro-targeting, but I think you need to do the user research to figure out how well people really like that. And maybe some of you saw a piece last year in the New York Times by Charles Duhigg, who also is an excerpt from his book on habits, where he talked about Target and how Target does customer profiling, and they had figured out that they could anticipate whether women were pregnant. And then, serve them coupons. And then they realized, well, some people probably don't want Target understanding that you're pregnant before possibly you even know you're pregnant. So, maybe we need to rethink how we actually, include those coupons for baby formula or what have you. And so they realized, if they randomized the appearance of those coupons within a flyer with, lawnmowers, then it wasn't exactly quite so spooky. And I think that's something to consider. You may be able to go to the maximum, but you probably don't really want to go to the maximum because you are going to creep people out.
It's a new kind of pregnancy test, the Target pregnancy test. If you get the coupon, you're pregnant.
Exactly.
So, men too. So we're running a little bit over, but I want to allow one precious question from the audience, and I wish we had a lot more time. I should have allocated more time. Next time we'll have an hour on privacy.
My name's Alan. Okay, so I understand the feel-good messages, but if you are just mapping people with no opt-in for their user ID, do you legally need to have something?
So legal. Okay.
Legal.
So we don't have a general privacy law in the United States. We have laws that prevent deceptive trade practices. And so if you say what you do, if you say in your privacy policy or you say somewhere that here's how I track and here's how what I do, you better be legally accurate. Is it possible that if you talk about cookie tracking and you talk about all kinds of other things, but then you have this big omission and you don't talk about this significant kind of thing that maybe the FTC could argue that you didn't tell us something important? Maybe. Probably not. Maybe. Right now, the FTC enforcement hook, I think, still depends on whether you're doing something that's deceptive. Do you say maybe you don't collect personal information, but yet something that's being collected is particularly personal? Now, I think what you need to do, right, to resolve the concerns of the critics is you need to try to minimize the sensitivity of the identifier, right, to the extent that people are using a MAC address. It's more sensitive than a cookie. I can't clear it, right? It's globally unique. Maybe there's somebody somewhere who's got a database and they've linked, explicit information to it. And so can I hash it? Can I have a retention policy so that I don't have it forever, so that if someone says, wait, am I gonna, do you have 3 years of records on, hundreds of places that I've been? The answer is, no, we delete it after X period of time. Is there an easy way for me to turn it off? Can we create a central opt-out or, some mechanism that I can get out? Can we make sure it's not being used for, perceived dastardly purposes? Can we take that off the table?
Okay, so unfortunately, we are out of time. I'm 4 minutes into Jeff's case study. There's a lot of questions around this stuff. Why don't, Jen, you say one final thing to the audience that they need to be concerned about or think about, or a framework for them to carry forward. And then Jules is around, presumably for the next little while. Are you leaving right after this?
I'm here.
So he's here. You can come to him and ask your specific questions to him point blank, and he'll give you free legal advice. Okay. Jen, you get the final word.
Okay. And I do have to leave, but if anybody
But you're not a lawyer, so you
I'm
can't
not a lawyer,
give legal
but if anybody
advice.
wants to contact me, I'm Jen
go ahead.
King at ischool.berkeley.edu. But the one thing I was going to add to what Jules said was, while the FTC definitely needs to focus on deceptiveness, part of also their charter is a question of unfairness. And I think there's been a larger realization as we've been looking at what's happening with cookies and third-party tracking online, that there's this growing sense that there's an unfairness to the consumer. And I think that paradigm shift is happening because there's been a movement away from consumers as being perceived as rational beings that can stand on their own 2 feet, to realizing that there is an extreme information asymmetry in play here. And that when you are basically, as an individual, up against a large kind of ecosystem that you can't even imagine, you don't even know how it works, and you're supposed to somehow navigate that ecosystem and make a choice about privacy. I mean, it's not equal footing. It's impossible from my point of view. So I just say that because I think the legal landscape could potentially be shifting into understanding that, because of the unfairness issue, there is a more, let's say, critical eye towards practices such as consumer manipulation, and I see it in my own work with user interfaces. Does this user interface?
So we need to wrap.
Yeah. Present a deceptive point of view, or can people actually kind of ascertain what's going on behind the scenes, or is it ultimately unfair? So I just argue that there's a shift going on, and if you are a third-party data collector, I think that should be of interest to you.
Okay, my regret is that we don't have more time to talk, and this is sort of a taste of what needs to be thought about. You can talk to Jules some more, and please join me in thanking these speakers for their insights.